Okay, now, one reason I wrote this book was I read Devil in the White City. Usually, if we were live, I'd say, how many of you read Devil in the White City? And I'll bet a lot of you are nodding about now saying, I did. Well, I love that book. And so I started thinking about World's Fairs, and I started to do some research. And what I found out was that Chicago had a second World's Fair 40 years later, which is amazing because nobody really knows about this. I do WGN with Rick Cogan a lot for my books, and he didn't know a lot about this fair, which is amazing because he's Mr. Chicago. But yes, they did. 40 years later, Chicago did it again. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first fair a little bit, and then we're going to jump to our fair. And both fairs are fascinating, but what you'll find is the second fair, the 1933 fair, is actually much more intriguing, and they went through a lot more problems than they did in the 1893 fair. So let's talk about first the Devil in the White City fair. The thing you want to take away from this is this fair really came about because Chicago wanted to say we've arrived. We're as good as New York. You know, we have as much culture. And so that's why if you read the book, you know what Chicago went through to put this on. The takeaway from this picture is all those buildings there, they're all these sort of white Grecian buildings. Well, that actually spread out across the country. And so that's why a lot of our government buildings look the way they do. So this was a very influential fair. Also, this was the first electrified fair, which had all these light bulbs, which was amazing to people in 1893. Now, this was a big deal at the fair. This was the kicker, right? Every fair has a kicker, and the 1933 fair will too. Now, you say big deal Ferris wheel. Well, this thing is twice the size of the one at Navy Pier. So it's a monster. Those are Pullman cars on that thing. A lot of people didn't think that actually this thing would turn because it was just so massive. But Mr. Ferris said, oh no, we'll get it to turn. Well, as you know, this became a staple at every single World's Fair following. Now, it was supposed to rival the Eiffel Tower. Now, it didn't do that, but still, this is something people wanted to get on. Because remember, nobody's flown at this point, so this thing is a monster when you're going up and getting these incredible views. Now, this was at the original fair too. So, shredded wheat. And what do we want to take away from this is consumer economy. Right after the Civil War, before the Civil War, we're a nation of farms. After the Civil War, we're becoming a nation of cities, urbanization. So these consumer goods, they're going to all those tracks they laid down for the war, they're now using to move consumer goods all around so you and I can go and get our shredded wheat. And so if you were born in 1870 or 1860 and you went to this fair, you're amazed to think, wow, I can get my whole breakfast in a box, which up to that point, nobody could. This came there too, Cracker Jack, all right? And again, same thing, consumer goods. And people kept these boxes as souvenirs because they weren't used to be able to getting all these things prepackaged. And of course, there is a prize inside. Now, this fair was so popular that they actually named a holiday for it. Yes, it's for Christopher Columbus, but the president said, this fair is so great, let's have a Columbus Day to actually commemorate the fair as well. Now, if you were sitting in front of me or I was standing in front of you, I'd be, who is this guy? And you'd all be like, H.H. Holmes. And you'd be right. So if you read Eric Larson's book, Devil in the White City, he's the main villain. Now, the thing to take away from this is Holmes is one of these guys who, took advantage of the fact that nobody tracked anybody at this point, right? We're tracked today by our phones, our watches, everything. But, at this time, with this urbanization, all these young women are coming to the cities. Young people want to get off the farms now. They want to, go become famous. And so nobody's tracking all these people. So Holmes took advantage of that and did all his nasty business. And a lot of those women disappeared. Nobody knew they were missing for months. But he was the dark force, if you will, of the 1893 fair. Now, there's a gap between the two fairs. In it, a lot of technology happens. This is the Wright brothers. So, in 1903, they fly. Now, this is a fascinating picture. Obviously, it's only as big as it is on your computer screen, but if you look closely, you can see on the right side, that's Wilbur off to the right, Orville's flying, and you see footprints. Now those footprints are from Wilbur, who has to hold the wing up. It's moving so slowly it'll dig into the sand. But amazingly, it gets off the ground for 12 seconds. Now, technology has a dark side. Titanic sinks in 1912. A lot of people, date the end of the Gilded Age to this, right, at this point. Where the technology, all that hubris, building an unsinkable ship. This has a dark side to it. Now, a darker side than even that is this, World War I. This is a war that's very different from any other war. This is mechanized warfare, 50 caliber machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks, mustard gas, chlorine gas. Now, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to go to this war. And he says to Woodrow Wilson, listen, I'm gonna get a force together like I did with the Rough Riders in Spain, and we're gonna charge the Germans. Woodrow Wilson said, absolutely not. He didn't want a dead president on his hands because Teddy Roosevelt would have gotten just above that trench and been cut down. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt being Teddy Roosevelt, never forgave Wilson. Now, the year before our fair, this happened. Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped. And again, if you're sitting here, I'd say to you, who was the man who put to death for this? One of you would say Bruno Hauptmann. Bruno Hauptmann was a little German guy. Now, Lindbergh is the most famous guy of his time. All right, he flew the Atlantic in 25. He marries Anne Morrow. All right, they move into a mansion in New Jersey, have a baby. The baby gets kidnapped. He gets a ransom note saying, give us $1 million. Lindbergh does it. They give it to him in marked bills. They find the baby a mile from the house dead. Then the case goes cold, the crime of the century. But these marked bills start circulating around. They trace it to this guy, Bruno Hauptmann, who says, this guy stayed with me who went to Europe and he left all his money behind. So I started to spend it. They could never find the guy in Europe. So they put Hauptmann to death. If you read a lot of books on this, they think Hauptmann was just the fall guy. Now, the year of our fair, 1933, this happens. Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor. Now, if he had died at this point, he would have been regarded as a pretty good statesman. The Autobahn, he built up the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, he built up the armed forces, the trains ran on time, everything was clean. Now, this gets more interesting. Charles Lindbergh goes over there to visit. Hitler invites him, and he sees the Air Force, he sees everything, and he comes back to America and says, you know what, this is the future. Fascism is the future. The democracy doesn't work. You can't control it. This is the way we want to go. Well, the Japanese, or rather, Britain gets in trouble. If you saw The Darkest Hour, they're barely hanging on. So Lindbergh starts a isolationist movement, and he calls it America First. America First. Japanese bomb us in 41. Lindbergh's disgraced forever. Now, 40 years later, so now we're up to our fair. Okay, so this is the cover of the book, obviously, but the thing you want to take away from that is you see where this fair is. This is actually on Northerly Island. So this fair is not connected to Chicago. It's built on Northerly Island. They enlarged the island. They brought in a lot of sand and gravel from Indiana and made it bigger. And this is where the fair is going to take place. And what does this mean? It means no building codes, because you know what? It's not part of Chicago, so they can do whatever they want. And they're going to have to, because they have no money, right? Innovation. Innovation can be a hallmark of the fair. Necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go along. Now, let's talk about how they open this fair. Okay, now, the light, what you see there on your screen is the light from Arcturus. All right, they thought, wouldn't it be cool to connect the 1893 fair to the 1933 fair? Okay, well, how do we do this? Well, how many, if you were sitting here, I would ask you this question. How many of you know that there was a big telescope in Elgin? It was there for the Timex, or the Elgin Watch Company, rather, okay? And they had this big telescope so they could set the watches by the stars. All right, well, they trained that telescope on Arcturus. Okay, so here's what they figured out. So they figured out that it takes 40 light years for the light from Arcturus to reach Earth. So they figured in 1933, that light started in 1893. So it comes into the telescope, hits a photoelectric cell, goes on a long cable all the way to Chicago to turn on the lights of the fair. Problem is, it didn't work. So they just threw a switch. But it was a great idea to try and start the fair. Now let's talk about some things that came out of the 33 fair. Plywood, you think big deal. Plywood was a big deal. No more plaster and lath. All right, the fair is going to bring about massive innovation because they have to build it fast. They have to build it on the cheap. And again, like the 1893 fair, they're under the gun. And so plywood, they develop a special adhesive for this. And suddenly you don't need all these guys with all this plaster and lath. Here's another thing they invented. Sheetrock. Sheetrock, again, you think, so what? Well, this is huge because you can tape these rooms together very quickly and move along. All these innovations will become part of the way they build homes. So prefabrication starts to become a big part of the fair, where they're putting things together before and then putting it together. All right, who's this? If you're sitting here, one of you would say Sally Rand. Okay, well, Sally Rand is a hillbilly, all right? She's from the Ozarks. She, like a lot of young women, want to become famous. So what does she do? She runs away with the circus 4 times. Finally, she makes it to the West Coast, bumps into an unknown producer named Cecil B. DeMills. And DeMills thinks she's the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. Now, she is only about 5 foot tall. She's very athletic, and she was actually an acrobat with the circus. This woman is very physical and will do just about anything. All right, so DeMills starts to put her into a bunch of silent movies. And believe it or not, Sally Rand, by the way, she gets her name. He gives her name by one day. She comes into his office and he goes, "What's your name?" And she says, "Harriet Beck." He goes, "That's not going to work." He looks around and he sees an atlas and he says, "Sally Rand." So that's how she gets her name. But she's actually becoming a silent movie star. Well, then the jazz singer comes along. And the jazz singer, as you probably know, brought in talkies. And what talkies did was it made all these silent movie stars or budding stars like Sally come along, and now they have to take a screen test with sound. Most of these people, you never heard their voice, ever. So Sally Rand, unfortunately, has an Ozark accent and a lisp. Cecil B. DeMille says, "I'm sorry, I can't use you anymore." He gives her walking papers. She takes her last $5 and heads for Chicago. We'll pick up with her in a little bit. Okay, how many of you have seen this? I'm sure a lot of you at the Museum of Science and Industry. Okay, let's talk about what our fair is. Our fair is supposed to celebrate the incorporation of Chicago 100 years later, okay, 1833. But they're like, it sounds kind of boring, history fair. What do you say we make it into a science fair? A fair of the future. We'll call it the Century of Progress. Okay, so the fair is going to morph. It's going to morph several times, all right? And this thing fits right in. It's a diesel electric locomotive, which it replaced steam. So, and this thing's wickedly fast. It does this big Denver to Chicago run, sets all these records, right? So the Zephyr is part of this. So now we're talking about technology. This is what our fair is about. A century of progress. So this fits right in. Microwave popcorn. How did this end up there? Well, General Electric had a building at the fair, and what they did is they had a big room. All these people would sit in the room, and they had a magnetron, and they throw the popcorn kernels down and zap them and turn them into popcorn. Probably zapped everybody else in the room because they didn't understand microwaves at the time, all right? Why did this take so long for us to get a microwave? Well, because they had to miniaturize it. Believe it or not, in World War II, a lot of those guys out on ships would take those big radar dishes and do the same things and make their own popcorn, right? Floating around in the Atlantic there. But eventually we did get it. But remember, you can remember when we first got microwaves, they said, be careful, with the microwaves. Well, they're still telling us that. Now, you could take a dirigible ride too. Now, remember, in 1933, nobody had flown, okay? Nobody. Only 10% of the people owned a car, which probably sounds remarkable, but it's true. A lot of people still stay in their neighborhoods. I mean, you still had horses. So to go into this was an amazing thing. Actually, my father-in-law was at this fair, and he said the best thing about it was there was women walking around with cigarettes around their necks. He was 10 years old, and they gave him a pack of cigarettes, and he could walk around smoking. So there you go, children having fun at the fair. All right, so now here's another thing you could do at the fair. Remember, this is a technology fair now. You could make a long-distance call, all right? So a lot of people, switches were local, basically. You didn't make long-distance calls, but Here, you could pick up the phone. A lot of people sit in the room. Your voice is on a speaker. You call Aunt Em out in California and have a big conversation. People just thought that was marvelous. Now, this is at the fair too. Television. This is called mechanical television. Now, it's not like ours, all right? You sit down in front of a huge contraption and you basically see a faint image of yourself. Well, this was still like you or I going to a fair and seeing a flying saucer, right? These people were mostly born in the 19th century or right around there. So, this was amazing to see this. Now, there was neon. Neon was at the fair too. Now, neon had been around, but Mr. Neon had a patent on it that was very expensive. Well, the patent expired, so the fair took neon and went crazy. They had all sorts of things. They had indirect lighting, which we take for granted, but the fact you could see light coming out of the ground was amazing to people. Also, they made fountains out of big tubes of light. And this cut cost because it actually didn't use water then. Now, you could also go there and see a car get assembled, right, from start to finish. And you think, well, so what? Well, nobody's seen mechanization before, right? So to see a car, you would go up on basically a balcony and watch this thing get assembled, then drive off. Was amazing. You could also see peas get canned. But the problem was you had to press this button to start the conveyor, and people were afraid to even press the button. Now, you put all this together, and you have the Rainbow City, all right? So remember, the first one's called the White City. Well, this is the Rainbow City. Now, how do they do this? Well, at this time, they really couldn't use colors on buildings. Well, they developed a paint for this fair specifically called Cason paint, and this paint wouldn't fade. So when you look at home movies, you can go online right now and look at old movies from this fair. This looks like Oz, and this is 6 years before the Wizard of Oz, right? Because all this Cason paint they would use, and there's pink and orange and blue and all these different colors. I mean, the world was monochromatic pretty much. Clothes didn't have colors. Al Capone's ties did, but everybody else was stuck with black and white, and buildings certainly didn't have color. So this was amazing. So this is the Rainbow City. Put it all together, and you have this: a century of progress. Now this thing, when it is basically a small city on the lake, used as much power as Madison, Wisconsin, had its own fire department, police department, its own hospital, employed 20,000 people, and they have better health care than we have, right? So they only have one problem now, only one problem. This guy. Probably thought I forgot about him, didn't you? No. Al Capone, the king of Chicago. Now, why do I call him the king of Chicago? Because he was, all right? This guy made $100 million off the sale of beer, okay? He ran Chicago. It's like a third world country. He ran it out of Lexington Hotel. He had an armor-backed chair, kind of like the one I'm sitting. You can't see it, so nobody could come and shoot him. He had an armored Cadillac he drove around in, right? And if you weren't on his payroll, you ended up in the Chicago River. So how did this happen? How did this one man get all this power? This, prohibition, right? Government got into the business of legislating morality at a time when people still wanted to drink. Al Capone had a great quote. He said, I'm just supplying a need. Down here, they call it bootlegging. On the North Shore, it's hospitality. I'm just supplying a need. And indeed, he was. And so what did Prohibition do? Prohibition changed the culture, okay? It basically changed the way people interacted. Okay, before Prohibition, men and women would get together, or rather, men would rather get together after work in a saloon and go drinking, okay? Then they go home. After Prohibition, men and women get dressed up, they go to a speakeasy, and by the way, Chicago had more speakeasies than any other city, right? They'd say, Johnny sent me, and by the way, the reason they call it a speakeasy is because you have to speak easy or somebody will hear you. And they go in there and they drink together. There's booze, there's sex, there's interracial mixing, there's jazz. This is the beginning of partying as we know it, okay? So what was the upshot of all this? People drank more than ever before. All right, I can't tell you how many times I've done book signings in Barnes & Noble and people came in and told me how Al Capone saved them and they made bootleg gin in their bathtubs. It's amazing. All right, so now this sort of becomes an institution. Scott Fitzgerald's going to make a lot of money off of Prohibition, and the biggest party ever, as he called it. You can see here, There's a picture of Mia Farrow and Robert Redford as the Great Gatsby. By the way, anybody know what Gatsby's profession was? He was a bootlegger. And, you know, there's a famous scene where he's told by Tom Buchanan, you're nothing but a bootlegger selling booze out of drugstores. By the way, how many people out there go to Walgreens? I'm sure you all do, right? Well, Walgreens only had about 50 stores before Prohibition. After, they had 500. What did they change? Well, they said they added ice cream and a fountain. What they really added was booze, all right? You can go there, get a prescription for your booze, take it, mix it with some lime juice. It's called a boxcar. And after you have the boxcar, which I have drank, you are very lit up. Believe me, it tastes like lighter fluid. I can't believe people drank things like that, but they did. Now, how many tests, or rather, how many people check the date on your milk? Right? I do. Everybody does. Al Capone bottled a lot of things. Al Capone had a huge operation. Not only did he bottle booze, he bottled milk. By the way, his brother, Frank Capone, had his own soda pop, Green River. Maybe you've heard of it. Okay? Well, anyway, Capone, as a kid in Brooklyn when he was poor, hated the fact that, you know, his milk was always sour. So while he's bottling all this milk, he saw this problem where milk would get sour. So he came with the idea of dating the milk, and they put it on the neck of the bottle. It went out and became an industry standard. So the next time you check your milk for the date, thank Al Capone. It's not sour. Okay, now this is Bugs Moran. He wants in on this $100 million a year, okay? He wants in on it. So his guys kill Capone's guys kill his guys. Finally, Capone says enough is enough, and this happens. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, all right? 7 guys against the wall, 2 guys in long coats, and a cop, all right? And they have this thing called a Thompson machine gun, all right? Now, this is a nasty, nasty weapon. This is invented by a guy named General Thompson in World War I. He had a problem. Whenever they overrun the trenches and the Germans would all run away before they could kill them all. He wanted a trench sweeper, something he could just kill tons of Germans with. So he builds his own gun, and in it takes a big clip. The gases from it basically go up into the gun and bring up the next round. He also had his own name for it. He didn't call it the Thompson. He called it the Annihilator, all right? So a lot of people didn't like the Annihilator. The British thought it was too loud. A lot of people said it bruised their ribs. Also, it was expensive, okay? But the Marines in World War II are going to love this gun when they get to the Japanese islands. But there was one group of guys that just thought this gun was perfect, and that was the gangsters, because you always got your man. Al Capone was introduced to this gun while he was having dinner on Clark Street. Car went by and raked his car, and he came out in the glass and everything in the restaurant, and he knew the game had changed. Well, let's talk about this picture some more. Now, I've seen the crime scene photos from this, all right, in the Chicago History Museum when I did the book, and these men were torn to pieces by those Tommy guns. Okay. Now, newspapers had a gentleman's agreement, if you will, where they said at the time, we don't put graphic photos on the front page in the newspapers. Well, guess what? They violated it. They put all these photos all over papers all over the country. And they said, look what's going on in Chicago. Gangsters killing people, cops killing people. And by the way, we're having a World's Fair in a few years. Please come to our city. All right. So nobody's going to come to the city if Al Capone's still there. So that's why I call it Al Capone in the 1933 fair, because the race is on. They have to get rid of Capone or nobody's going to come to this fair. All right. People are starting to realize that the reputation of Chicago is so bad, the fair could be a disaster. And by the way, fairs are years and years in the planning. You know, they take forever to get planned. So this could be a financial disaster. Now, here's somebody with a couple of these trench sweepers, as Thompson liked to call them too. You can see these are monster guns, those big 100 round barrel clips there. This was a nasty weapon. Now, let's talk about Al Capone and how people view him. We have a view of Capone as this gangster, this killer, right? Believe it or not, in 1933, people didn't view him that way. They actually viewed him like a celebrity. When you look at films of Capone, they have the streets cordoned off, people mobbing. Why? Because he was a celebrity. He had all this money. He wore a $50,000 ring on his finger. He had flashy ties. And, again, I can't tell you how many times people came to me in book signings and would say, Al Capone saved my family. Well, why would they say that? Well, because Capone employed a lot of people. He also gave money to a lot of people, all right? So there was this sort of Robin Hood quality to him. And people said he only killed the people he had to kill. He didn't kill anybody indiscriminately. So he was looked on somebody, actually, he's a stable figure in a strange way. Someone who kind of kept Chicago under control. But again, more like a sports figure today or a rock figure. So there was this celebrity factor there. All right. Now, in that picture right there, look how far back everybody is from him. Okay. Here he is coming down with his famous white fedora. They're clearing the way out for him. Right. He would go to court. They would, bring him into court for various things, but the fix was always in. All right. Somebody was always paid off, and Capone never, ever got convicted. Okay. So getting rid of him is going to be problematic. Now, as if that's not enough for our fair, this happens, the stock market crash, okay? And this was just nasty, all right? The Great Depression, which, again, they're saying our employment levels are at that level now, but this thing came up, and this was going to hang around for a while, all right? And so basically, when the market crashed, a lot of people in the middle class had all their money in there, and then the whole consumer economy sort of collapsed. Now, this is a picture from Chicago. And this was Chicago got hit very hard. There was 25% unemployment in Chicago. And so people literally lost all their money overnight. As you probably know, the bank accounts weren't insured. So when banks failed, in the great movie, It's a Wonderful Life, you see that, scene with the bank run. You just lost all your money. So, things basically got very dire. Of course, FDR came in and said, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And then he closed all the banks for 3 days. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to stop the runs on the banks. Otherwise, all the banking system would totally collapse. People started riding the rails. Why? Because they had to go find jobs. People just left their families in droves, and because it was that hard now to survive. Now, Chicago had no money. Chicago was bankrupt itself. So who could help people? This guy did. Al Capone. He set up soup kitchens all over the South Side that people go to. And that's why people come up to me and say, Al Capone saved my family. Because he had the money to help people, and he did. So he also had a habit of kind of throwing $100 bills around to people and things like that. So this is the background of how we're going to have a fair. So the question is, how do you build a fair with no money? Now, a lot of people thought having a fair was insane. They're like, not only do we have no money to build a fair, we don't have any money to even spend at a fair. So how's this going to work? Well, Chicago being Chicago says, we'll work it out. We're just going to do this thing. So they turned to this guy. This guy's name is Charles Dawes. Charles Dawes, sort of a Renaissance man. He's a vice president. And Dawes has a brother, Rufus Dawes, who's president of the World Fair Association, okay, that's going to create the fairs. Rufus says to Charles, I need your help. Now, by the way, Charles Dawes is the only vice president to ever have a #1 hit called It's All in the Game, which was recorded in the 1950s by Tommy James, all right? So he's this very eclectic guy. Well, Charles Dawes says, I've got a couple ideas here, how to get the money. First thing he does is he has a subscription drive, which basically Chicagoans can all come up and give like $1 or something, and they get special privilege at the fair. Well, he raises millions doing this. Then he creates what's called gold notes. Now, gold notes are a bond issue, but they're based on the fair. So if the fair doesn't come out, the gold notes are worthless. And people are like, why in the world would anybody take these gold notes? Well, he sells millions of them. And then he starts to use them like currency. And he, instead of giving contractors money, he gives them gold notes. And they said to these contractors, why would you take those? And the contractor said, because there's nothing else. All right. So Dawes is very smart. Then he goes to the powers that be, the corporations. He says, listen, come to Chicago and build your buildings here and show your wares, and let's get the economy going. Okay, the fair is morphing again. Remember, it's a century of progress. Well, now it's a consumer fair. Now it's going to be a fair to get the economy moving out of the Great Depression. So what we're saying now is, you know what? The future is going to be better. Technology and a consumer-based economy, we're going to spend our way out of this thing. Everything's going to be better. And this all works together. But we still got a problem. Al Capone. A lot of carnage in Chicago, people just mowing people down. Here's Capone talking to the DA. The guy's saying, hey, do you know anything about that Saturday night massacre? You know, Capone, St. Valentine's Day massacre. And Capone says, I don't know. Ask Bugs Malone. Bugs Malone says, I don't know. Ask Capone. So they get nowhere. Meanwhile, he's buying off all the judges and juries. By the way, everybody always wanted to have their picture taken with Capone. This is one from the judge's bench. So we know where the judge is on this, okay? So besides all that, Capone's just a family man. Here he is in Florida. He loves Florida, by the way. And he was in Florida when the St. Valentine's Massacre happened. And, you know, you talk to his family. He loved having popcorn. He loved having big meals. But there's another side to Al Capone. This side. And you never called Al Capone Scarface, okay? He didn't like that. Now, he was very media savvy, all right? How media savvy is he? Was he? If you go to a desert island today and go on it, and you see one person and you say, Chicago, bang, bang, what are they going to say? Al Capone. This is before the internet, all right? So this guy understood mass media. But he never liked a picture like this. He always had people take a picture on the other side. He got that scar from being a bouncer in New Jersey, where a guy came up with a woman. Capone said something lewd to the woman. The guy pulled a knife and cut up his cheek. Capone eventually caught up with that guy, but he got this terrible scar. But he would always powder it over and again. He never liked a photo like that. Okay, this is basically Chicago, a little bit before our fair, but kind of where it is this very dingy place. But on the lakefront, this incredible multicolored city is coming up. Now, question is, who built this thing? Well, there were 8 architects, all right? But Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't one of them, all right? He was probably the most famous architect of his time, and if you didn't believe it, just ask him, he'd tell you. Now, why wasn't he involved? Well, he wasn't involved because he didn't play well with others, all right? And Frank Lloyd Wright was furious that he didn't get invited to the party. So he came with his own designs, and I'll just tell you 2 of them. One, he was going to put the entire fair in a high-rise. Everything, cars and all, this giant high-rise. It was nuts. The second one was he was going to put it out in the lake, floating around on barges. A lot of people thought he lost his mind. But Frank Lloyd Wright, to his dying day, never stopped calling the fair a bunch of modernistic garbage, and how it was awful. Now, they used this guy, Joseph Urban. He's a Hollywood guy to do color and light for the fair, right? He did Busby Berkeley films, Ziegfeld Follies. Now, Urban's a bit of a dilettante, though, and he says, listen, I'll do it, but I want a convertible. And I want to be driven around, and I want to point to the buildings when they're getting painted and lit. Problem is, Urban's not healthy. He dies. They take his plants anyway and use them. All right, so now this is a fair. This is the Rainbow City, and this is a poster from the fair. Now, it says 1934. Now, this fair was only supposed to go 1 year, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt goes to it, and he says, you know what? This is amazing. This fair, can you keep this open another year? I think we can get out of the Great Depression with this place. And so they do. So they actually, Congress kicks in a couple $100,000 to help out, and so they keep the fair open another year. Now, remember we talked about the Ferris wheel. That was a kicker, okay? So the kicker is the event that you're supposed to be really like wild with it. And by the way, you went to a World's Fair to be wild. You went to a World's Fair to come away seeing something exotic. This is before television, so this was your chance, right? Well, they come with some ideas for the 33 fair. One is Heinz comes in and says, you know, we're going to build a giant pickle. It's going to be the world's largest pickle. People can go up to the top of the pickle and look off. It'll be amazing. Well, they start to build the pickle, and it turns out to be really expensive and not very practical. And so they pull out. So they're back to square one, and they come up with this, the Sky Ride. Now, this thing is 625 feet up in the air, all right? That's a Pullman car. And it doesn't go very fast, although they call it a jet car. But here's the thing. Nobody's flown before. So this is like flying to these people, and it goes back and forth. Now, they weren't sure this thing would work because that was the longest breach span in the world. And the technology was being pushed. So what they did was they loaded these things with wet sand first. They went across. When it didn't fall off, they put the people in, all right? So this is supposed to be the kicker of the fair, the thing that everybody will remember, all right? It took 6 million pounds of steel to build this thing. The photos of these guys building it are incredible. And always the wet sand went first to make sure everything was okay. But actually, the thing they're really going to remember is this woman, Sally Rand. All right, now remember her? Let's pick up with her. She was sleeping in alleys, couldn't find work, Great Depression had hit. And so the Paramount Theater on State Street puts an ad in the paper saying, we need some dancers. Sally Rand goes to a secondhand store and finds these giant 5-foot ostrich feathers, okay? And she gets a little outfit. She buys them and she goes down for her tryout at the Paramount Club. And the guy at the Paramount Club, she's getting ready to go on, and her little outfit doesn't work. And the woman next to her says, just go on naked and use the feathers. So she does. She gets the job. Go figure, right? Okay, so now Sally Rand's employed. But Sally Rand always saw herself as an actress, a Hollywood actress. And so her whole thing is how to get back to Hollywood. All right. So the biggest show in town, though, is in Chicago, the 1933 World's Fair. So she goes down there to try out. And they go, sorry, we don't need a fan dancer. So Sally Rand comes up with a plan. Opening night of the fair. Here it is. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this picture. I've given this speech a lot of times, all right? A lot of times. And at one of the speeches, a woman came up to me and said, see that woman on the fender? That's my mother. And she showed me a picture of her, and that's her, which is amazing, okay? But at any rate, so this is the opening night of the fair. There's fireworks, all sorts of things. Now, here's what Sally Rand does. Now, remember the fair is on Norley Island. Sally Rand gets a white horse, a boat, and she gets the boat, gets on the white horse. She only has on a wig and a little cape, all right? That's it. And she gets on the boat, goes around to the back of Norley Island there, okay? And the opening night of the fair. Now, at the opening night, all the muckety-mucks are there. They're all there in a big stage, all right, watching a show. Sally Rand goes up to a yacht landing. The guy thinks she's part of the show, gets off that boat, and gallops through the World's Fair, all right, all the way to that stage. That horse jumps up onto the stage. All these photographers take her picture, rears up. People go, oh, my God, it's the opening night of Chicago World's Fair, a naked woman on a white horse. She immediately gets arrested and then immediately gets hired. She becomes the #1 financial attraction, the #1 attraction of the World's Fair, and also the #1 money maker. She takes the fair literally from the red to the black. They have to hire extra accountants for her. Her show is only about 17 minutes, all in, but she has like 15 of these a day, right? And people can't get enough of her. She becomes world famous overnight with this feather dance. Now you can watch it online still. The question is, why did this happen? And why did she become so successful? Well, because she provided escapism at a time when there wasn't a lot of escapism. You would go into this dark theater. There's a blue light on her, classical music, and she danced around behind these feathers, these ostrich feathers. And it was like watching this little nymph in the darkness. Men and women went to see her. And for a while, the Great Depression was gone. You were gone. And so this was immensely popular. She would even go from there to the Chicago Theater at night to do her show. All right. So, I mean, she just hit this vein. And also the World's Fair also had this huge media machine that was pumping out all this media, and she was part of it. And so they made her just world famous overnight. Now, every time she danced, she got arrested. She got arrested 4 times a day for indecency. Here's an actual photo of her being arrested. Now, she loved it because it increased her notoriety. She loved being in the newspapers, and she was right. More people wanted to see her then. But a judge gets tired of this. He's in Chicago, and he says, I'm tired of this woman coming into my courtroom. I'm going to go see the show. So he goes and watches the show, comes out there and says, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Never bring her back to my courtroom. But Sally Rand would always be getting arrested. So she's going to go on the road soon. We'll pick up with her. Now, if you're sitting here, I'd say, who's this? And you'd say, Judy Garland. And I would say to you, is she famous yet? No. It's 6 years before The Wizard of Oz. But she's there with her sister and her mother. They have a horrible singing and dancing act. Her words, not mine. Okay. Hot night. Fair opens in the summer. She gets in a fight with her mother. Leaves the fair, goes to the Biograph Theater. Why? Because the Biograph's air conditioned. Goes in there, sees a man she thinks she knows. All right. Goes up to it, and she thinks he's a movie star. And she goes up to him and says, "Hey, mister, can I have your autograph?" He goes, "Sure, little lady." 3 hours later, he's shot dead in the alley, John Dillinger. She tells his story 25 years later. But it shows how everybody was at this fair. Like, this World's Fair. Everybody was coming there like moths to a light. Now, again, I would say to you, who's this? And you'd say Elliot Ness, all right, or Kevin Costner. All right. Now, probably a lot of you saw The Untouchables, okay? Great story. Too bad it's not true, all right? This guy, Oscar Fraley, he's a writer just like me, all right? Now, Ness has a hard life after Prohibition. He becomes a drunk, gets divorced, can't keep a job, but he bumps into a guy in the 1950s who says basically, "Hey, you know any stories from Prohibition from those years?" And he says, "Yeah, I do." And so Ness writes a manuscript, a few pages, gives it to this guy, and then he dies. This guy reads it and says, "This is pretty good, but it needs something else." So he creates the whole Untouchable thing, makes the whole thing up, and adds it to it. Now, Ness was there. Here's old Ness looking a little worse for wear. He's a drunk, he's a depressive, so probably had a few too many at this point. And he was there as a Prohibition agent. There just weren't any Untouchables. That whole thing was made up by Fraley. And what Ness did was he went around breaking up stills and things like that. But, you know, this is too good a story to go away. So here's Robert Stack with a Thompson machine gun there. There's a scene from The Untouchables with Sean Connery. It's the book itself sold millions of copies. It was a great, great story. Problem is, it wasn't true. So the question is, if Ness didn't get him, who got Al Capone? Well, a lot of you might say, well, they got him with income tax evasion. That's how they got him. The guys who got him were these guys. They're called the Secret Six. The Secret Six. And they're 6 Chicago millionaires who banded together to get rid of Capone because, you know what? He was bad for business with all these killings. Now, the Secret Six did some interesting things. They created a secret police force. And one of the first things they did was created a speakeasy, all right? And in the speakeasy, they had actual booze, and they got information. Then they had their own gangsters. We call them informants, okay? And these gangsters would bring them all sorts of information. And then they came up with this really innovative thing called a witness protection program, where they would send guys down to South America for a while so they could testify, and then they bring them back, all right? Then they studied Capone's operation. They figured out how much money he made per bottle of beer, and they started to attack his factories and his distribution centers and things like that. So who were these guys? Whoops, let's go back one. Julius Rosenwald. He's actually the guy bankrolled most of it. He's president of Sears, all right? Then we have Robert McCormick. Now, Robert McCormick's the publisher of Chicago Tribune, but he gets into this in a different sort of way. Now, how many of you have been to Billy Goat's Tavern down there in the underground on Michigan Avenue? Well, I'm sure a lot of you have, all right? I love the burgers. Okay. Now, Jake Lingle is a mob reporter of his time. People love mob reporters because they give them the inside dope. Well, Lingle one day comes out of the Chicago Tribune building, goes to the underground there about where Billy Goat's Tavern is. This guy comes up, shoots him in the back head, and kills him. McCormick says, that's it. Capone is trying to muzzle the press. And actually, McCormick sold a lot of newspapers because of Capone. But he figures that's the last straw. He's trying to muzzle the press. Well, the fact was, Lingle was on the take. He had a huge bank account, they found out. So really, he got rubbed out because he probably owed a lot of people money and got too far into it. Robert Isham Randolph, president of the Chicago Commerce Commission, he too is part of the Secret Six. Now, they aren't quite sure who the other 3 guys were, because a lot of these guys on their deathbed would say, you know what, I got one last thing to say. I was part of the Secret Six. Well, they got to about the Secret 20, and they're like, okay, somebody's lying. But this was enough, and so have to get Capone. How do they do it? Let's talk about income tax. Okay, in 1933, most people didn't pay income tax. Why? Because most people didn't make enough money. I think I had to make $5,000 to hit it. And the IRS was teeny. So income tax, convicting somebody for income tax evasion was unheard of, all right? So what they're trying to get Capone on, the only thing they can get him on, is really sort of outlandish. But Capone finally says, you know what? Okay, fine. I'll cut a deal. I'll do a couple of years, for saying I didn't pay tax on $100,000 or so. Government says, well, that's probably the best we can do. So they set up the deal, the plea bargain, and Capone comes to get his deal. And on the day, they walk up to a guy named Judge Wilkerson. And Capone's lawyers say, we're here to do our deal, a couple of years. And Judge Wilkerson says, no. And they said, what do you mean? We've got a deal. And he says, nope. Well, what happened is the president called Wilkerson and said, no way. You got to send this guy away. It's got to go beyond 2 years. So now Capone has to actually go to trial. So Capone does what he always does. He bribes the jury, right? When they get wind of this, they get the list, and then, as you saw in the movie, they switched it. They switched the jury around, all right? And Capone ended up with these guys from downstate, farmers. Now, they don't care that Capone's a flashy gangster. They see the devil, okay? Because these guys haven't seen $1,000 in their life, all right? And they see this guy in this flashy suit with a $50,000 ring on his finger. These guys are religious men. They go to church. And Capone's lawyers try and get rid of them, but they just can't. And these guys convict Capone for income tax evasion for 11 years. Here's a picture of Capone not looking so happy there. And the very day he gets convicted, Thomas Edison dies. Two parts of history coming together. But for tax evasion, they get him for 11 years. Here's the verdict right here. Now, this next slide is a very interesting one because this is Capone on his way to jail. Right? Remember we talked about him being a celebrity? At every station stop, his train was mobbed, people trying to see him, okay? And look at Capone's expression. He's like, I'll get out of this, don't worry. Look at his lawyers, like, no, he won't, it's over, right? And that's his first jail cell there on the right, right? That's in Atlanta. Now, those amenities you see in there, people got very upset about that. And the government started getting a lot of blowback, saying Capone's getting special privileges, so they sent him to Alcatraz. Now, Alcatraz was awful. Solitary confinement, you weren't allowed to talk, and you sure couldn't escape from it, right? And Capone had another problem, so you know probably what it is, syphilis, all right? Syphilis is a nasty disease that comes back 30 years later and drives you insane. Well, Capone started to lose his mind, basically, and couldn't remember things. One of the things he forgot was where he buried his millions of dollars, all right? Now, if some of you maybe ever remember that thing with the vault where Geraldo Rivera was going to go into the vault and find these things from Al Capone. Well, they thought the money was in that vault. It wasn't. I think there was a pop can there. But to this day, nobody has found the missing money. Now, the fair opens, and an amazing turnabout, Prohibition ends. And they're allowed to sell beer. And they sell a ton of beer. They make a ton of money. So all the fighting and everything that's been going on over Prohibition and beer and everything, it's over. Because now the fair just cashes in on it. Here's the queen of the fair. This is a very rare photo right there. Now, again, they employed 20,000 people. And look at this picture, because the fair opened on like a really hot day, like 100 degrees. Look at all that wool everybody has on. You think we have it bad, right? But the fair brought in people from all over the world, all over the world. It was immensely popular and very successful at a time of the worst year of the Great Depression. Eleanor Roosevelt comes there. You can see there, again, FDR was there. What happened to Sally Rand? Well, Sally Rand, after the fair, goes on the road. Now, I actually have a book coming out on her next fall. And when you read her letters, it's very sad because they're from all over the country, but all over from hotels. She could never get off the road. If she ever put down those fans, she quit making money. She married 3 different husbands, one worse than the other. They all took her money. She made millions of dollars, but she had nothing left to show for it. At the end of her life, she ended up destitute. Sammy Davis Jr. had to bail her out. He gave her $10,000 for her medical bills, and she died broke. But she did become a star, which was, what she set out to do. All right, this is actually the Berghoff. Great place. Good times are back. Here's Capone at the jail. He gets out, and he actually ends up dying at home. He has a stroke. He's buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery, although a lot of people say he's not there. They say he's actually somewhere else. Now, the last night of the fair is sort of interesting. The last night of the fair, basically Chicagoans went crazy. Why did they do this? They started fires and stole everything that wasn't nailed down. Well, because it's still the Great Depression, and they knew the fair was going to be torn down. The fair was built by a guy named Lara, and Lara was a military guy who built the fair so it could be put up quickly and torn down quickly. And that's exactly what they're doing. So people just stole everything, thinking, they're going to get rid of it anyway. And in the morning, all this stuff was scattered all over the place. Now, the Sky Ride had 2 towers. They blew up the first tower. And everybody in Chicago got very mad and said, why didn't you invite us to see the tower get blown up? So they loaded up the second tower with dynamite, invited everybody, blew it sky high. Chicagoans love that. And again, here's Capone, Mount Carmel. Again, his body's not really there, or his ashes. Now, why is this picture here? Well, this is sprawl. And the reason I have it here is because all those building techniques we talked about in the beginning, they're all used today, right? These houses that you see that get put up very quickly, they have a time limit on them, just like the fair. People don't like to hear that, but they do. And they're built quickly, prefab, using sheetrock and everything, and all those techniques that were developed at the fair. What's this guy doing here? Wrong slide? No, O.J. Simpson. Well, the reason I have him here is because they used the Capone prosecution against him, okay? And what's the Capone prosecution? Basically, you get him for one thing, but you're really getting him for something else. All right, let's talk about Capone. We know he's a killer and he did all this booze, moved all this booze. What they get him for? Tax evasion. This guy, remember what they got him for? They put him in jail for 11 years because he went and held up some guys who stole his trophies and his football cards and stuff, right? But what they really did was they were punishing him for the first crime, which was he killed his wife and her boyfriend. Okay, fair ended up with 39 million people. Some people say it was as high as 50 million. So it was immensely popular. Now, all that's left of this fair is this. This came from the Italians. It's still there. It's Mussolini's gift. And some people say it represents fascism and they want to get rid of it. So I'm going to read you the very last paragraph from the book. If you walk on Northerly Island today, there's nothing left of the fair except for the one Roman column donated by the Italians. It sits there as a strange monolith to a people long gone. The bikers ride past along the lakefront on brightly colored bikes, wearing synthetic clothes that would have amazed people in 1933. But the fair gave them a glimpse of the future, and the column stands as a totem between past and present. One can touch the smooth column, blink, and for just a second, see those people at the fair during the Great Depression, trying to find a moment of light in all that darkness. They are not so different from ourselves. Thank you.